Okay, well, welcome. My name is Nicole Crome. I am the Membership and Outreach Manager at Longwood Gardens, and I am thrilled to welcome you all here this afternoon for our afternoon's talk on our orchid preservation project. So you are all in for a really engaging and insightful hour, and there's going to be time at the end for Q&A, but you can certainly ask questions at any point during the presentation. You can just use the chat feature at the very bottom of your screen, and we will get to them at the very end. Feel free to note that this is going to be recorded and will be posted to the member section of the website after today. We are lucky enough today to be joined by Christopher Miller, principal at John Milner Architects. Christopher joined the firm in 1998, and he has been a principal with the firm for over 10 years. He's focused on his architectural career on historically significant ecclesiastical, institutional, and cultural property projects that involve restoration, rehabilitation, adaptive reuse, and sensitive additions. Also with us today is Joshua Kiehl, Senior Associate at John Milner Architects. Joshua began his architectural career in 2002 and spent a significant portion working at John Milner Architects. He is a registered architect and project manager with responsibilities that include new traditional residential design, along with managing institutional and ecclesiastical projects with historic preservation focus. Joshua was elevated to the position of senior associate at the firm in 2020. Congratulations. And from Longwood, we welcome Greg Griffis, our senior horticulturist. Greg became aware of orchids in 2009 through a college friend. Studying at Westchester University, from where he graduated with a degree in music education, because every botanist is also a music educator. It put him in close proximity to Longwood Gardens, and he attended in the 2010 Longwood Orchid Show, where he purchased his very first orchid. One plant quickly became 20 or so, and before long he was hooked. And beginning in 2015, Greg began working as an orchid grower at Longwood. And there he grows all of the major genre of orchids and has become part of cultivating a collection of terrestrial orchids from around the world, as well as many rare and unusual orchids. So I want to thank all of our panelists for being here with us today, and I am going to turn this presentation over to them. Thank you all so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Greg Griffis. I'm the orchid grower here at Longwood Gardens. And so hopefully by now, you've had a chance to hear about our Longwood Reimagined project. So if you haven't yet, it's this sweeping reimagination of 17 acres of our conservatory and grounds. There'll be new landscapes, a gorgeous new conservatory, which you can see in the rendering there, a new restaurant. There's going to be a new bonsai courtyard outside of our new administration building, more event spaces. The water lily court's going to be reimagined as well. And the entire project will be completed in the fall of 2024. But the first area that will be completed, and the only one that will actually be open to the public before 2024, is the orchid display, which obviously is very important to me and something that I'm incredibly excited about. And so this is our sort of preview into the work that we've been doing for what is now the last few years on our orchid display. So our orchid collection houses about 6,000 plants, and we have about 3,000 different taxa, and we cover the whole gamut of the orchid world, which is part of our goal. And our display is visible throughout the entirety of the year. We are actively breeding new plants. We've got dozens of seed pods in the lab. We'll have hundreds of seedlings coming out, which you'll see coming into our display over the next couple of years. We actually recently moved all of the growing spaces because of this Longwood Reimagined project. We got greenhouses that are new to the orchids, which have increased what we're capable of doing, and our culture is improving, and things just keep getting better and better in the orchid collection. So aside, or perhaps hand in hand with the fact that our orchid collection is continuing to grow and improve, we are also growing and improving our orchid display. And so I'm going to hand it over to John Milner Architects, and they're going to tell you more about a lot of the work that's been going on to move into and build our new orchid display.
Hello, my name is Christopher Miller, And over the next few slides, I'd like to reference Longwood's history in a general way, and then the conservatory complex and the Orchid House a little more specifically. Pictured here is Pierre S. Dupont, who purchased the country estate that is now Longwood Gardens in 1906. Next slide. It is worth noting that the property was owned by George Pierce and his descendants from the early 18th century and was a land grant from William Penn. In the 19th century, it was America's first significant arboretum collection of conifers. It was first known as Pierce's Arboretum, then Evergreen Glade, and later as Pierce's Park. After purchasing the property, a primary focus for Mr. Dupont was conservation and preservation. Next slide. Pictured here is the Pierce Dupont House, which is located to the east of the conservatory complex. The first brick section of the house to the right was built by the Pierce family in the 18th century. And Mr. Dupont enlarged and altered the house greatly in 1914, adding the large conservatory at the center, which is shown here flanked by two brick gables. Mr. Dupont drew inspiration from classical orangeries in Europe and the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876 for this conservatory and for the main conservatory complex. Next slide. Shown here is a recent plan view of the entire conservatory complex. This plan is oriented with south at the bottom, where the fountain gardens are located. On the right-hand side of the slide, in a darker shade of blue, is the original main conservatory complex, which consisted of the main conservatory at the center, and we're pointing to it. We'll be pointing as we kind of go. The exhibition hall directly above to the north. Flanking the main conservatory are two wings, or hyphens, as they're called, that were originally peach houses. And there are two pavilions, or display houses, that bookend the hyphens, the Camilla House to the far right, and the Orchid House, which is a focus of today, to the far left. These are the primary conservatory structures that Mr. Dupont built between 1919 and 1921. Next slide. Shown here are historic images of the main conservatory. An historic construction photograph is shown at left, and the right-hand photograph shows early use of the exhibition hall space. One unique aspect of the main conservatory was that it was open to the public. Note the display of fruits and vegetables grown at Longwood Farms on the table in the right photograph. Next slide. This is a wonderful historic photograph and view of the conservatory complex from the southwest. On the right-hand side are the early conservatory structures, including the main conservatory, which is symmetrically flanked on east and west by hyphens and display houses, and the exhibition hall directly to the north. Next slide. This historic photograph was taken around the same time from the southeast and includes the main conservatory at the center of the image. The orchid display house is shown here to the left of the main conservatory. Through the years, there have been production greenhouses and back-of-house structures around the conservatories and gardens, which have been changed and altered in support of evolving horticultural needs. Next slide. Shown here again is the plan view of the entire conservatory complex. On the right-hand side of the slide, in darker blue again, is the main conservatory complex. We highlighted in yellow the two pavilions or display houses that are bookends at the east and west. The Orchid House is the pavilion to the left, which is just to the west of the present-day Acacia Passage and Silver Garden. Next slide. This is an original plan drawing dated to 1920, which was developed by the DuPont Engineering Department of the peach houses and display houses that flank the main conservatory. The main conservatory is not shown, but would be at the center of this drawing. The display house at the far left, again, is the Orchid House. Next slide. At left in this original drawing is a building elevation of the south facade of the West Display House, today known as the Orchid Banana House. The drawing was developed by the DuPont Engineering Department in 1920. Next slide. These are two early photographs of the Orchid Banana House. Greg is going to talk more about the plants in the Orchid House, but you can see that banana trees were located in the display house in the early days in both photographs. Next slide.
So to the best of our knowledge, this display house was an economic house originally, full of plants that were valued for their economic properties, whether it was flax or any plants really that you could use that way. You can see there's some vanilla in there, papayas, all sorts of different things that have economic value. In 1922, then, Mrs. Dimmick of Scranton, Pennsylvania, gave Alice DuPont, Mrs. DuPont, 12 orchids, and this sort of initiated the DuPont's love of orchids. Over the next 20 years, they would buy hundreds of orchids from all over the world, importing them from France and England, from the best growers in California and New Jersey. And this led to a rather large collection. And so we can look at then some early pictures of the orchids in the display cases. The case on the left here, this is a photograph from 1928, and on the right is one from 1947. And these cases, which came into the conservatory probably in around 1922, were the primary display location for the orchid collection. And actually, if you look at these photographs, the wrought iron gates that are holding up those orchids are being conserved and will reappear in our new orchid display when it reopens, which is really exciting. And so then in 1948, the DuPonts were given what was at that point probably one of the most prestigious orchid collections in the United States. And that was the collection of Ethel DuPont, or Mrs. William K. DuPont, who was a cousin of Pierre and Alice. And this collection was about 2,000 plants. And it quickly doubled or more the size of their orchid collection and brought it up to a national level. And so in these photographs, you can see these are pictures of the collection from 1956, 59, 70, and 74, just showing some of the progress and the growth of the collection. And what we'll see is that growth and change is a consistent reality in the orchid collection. So the next change would come in 1977. So if you remember the orchid display as it was, there's the alcove. And if you look in the left photograph, this is the alcove before it belonged to the orchids, back when it actually belonged to Longwood's Gesneriad collection. Well, in 77, with the burgeoning orchid collection, the Gesneriads were moved into what we would know as the Mediterranean garden, and the orchids expanded into the alcove with new wrought iron gates. And then they took that space, and you can see the picture on the right is actually one of the corners there, where the north walls would meet the alcove from 77. And they stayed in this configuration until 1983. And then in 1983, the largest expansion of the orchid display occurred when they took those cases, which at that point were mirrored the north walls by only a few feet, and they moved them 12 feet to the south. And new gates were made to go on the east and west walls. And so at that point, the economic house was actually disbanded. It was spread throughout the rest of the conservatory, and it became the banana house as we've known it up until now. And then in 1990, they placed these faux walls, the faux stucco walls, which you can see in this photograph, behind the orchids. There you go. You can see them there on the left. And that was the final amendation to the orchid house until today. But what was incredible is, as we started to look through the history, what we discovered was that one of the key characteristics of the orchid collection was that it was always changing, growing, and expanding. And so in 2018, when we first began to talk about this Longwood Reimagined project, the Orchid House was actually going to be restored exactly as it was. And we began to look around and say to each other, well, what if we use this as an opportunity to do what the Orchid Collection has always done, to grow and expand and to make things better, true to Longwood's character. And so originally I took some ideas forward to some important people, and then we formed an internal design team, which was myself, our interior display designer, our landscape architect and program manager, and our art director. So needless to say, I now know what it's like to sit in a room of display giants. And so we sat together and we began to work out pragmatically and aesthetically what this display might look like if we were to take it to the next level. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Joshua, and he's going to tell you more about that process.
Hi, so I'm Joshua Kiehl. I'm an architect with John Milner. Like Greg mentioned, initially the concept for the restoration of the Orchid House was a restoration in kind. There were a number of failed components or outdated components that we were looking to restore, particularly with roof. Some of the bronze door and window systems, a lot of the concrete had been patched over the years. And with the larger West Conservatory project underway, the Orchid House is going to become the western entrance point for visitors to the historic conservatory complex. So initially when we began the project, it was largely to a facelift and to update the exterior of the building, repair a lot of deteriorated materials, but largely keeping the building in the same configuration and layout as existed. One of our first steps for the project towards that end was to conduct a detailed conditions assessment of the materials that we were looking to repair. And one of the challenges early on that we had identified as we started to do the detailed survey was the concrete and the concrete patching. And you can see here on the slides, there are some photos of past patchwork to the concrete where either the concrete had been spalling or had been damaged through weather and ice and freeze-thaw cycles. And repairs had been made to the buildings, not only the Orchid House, but other buildings on Longwood's campus. And it had been a challenging process to match the concrete in the exact color and texture as to what was there. So as we started to look at the concrete and started to talk to the Longwood masonry shops and the different staff about past repair work that had been done there, we started to suspect that maybe the concrete, although it's an exposed aggregate concrete, maybe it was a more unique type of concrete. And one of the things that we wanted to look into was whether or not this was what is called mosaic concrete. And that is a concrete that was developed by an artisan named John Early. So we started researching with our conservators John Early's work and looking for reference to Longwood. And we worked with the Longwood archives, and we were actually able to determine, we found in going through the archival records at Longwood, we found original documentation, specifications and correspondence that did identify the Longwood buildings, the original 1920s conservatory complex, as having been, John Early had been involved in that process. So who is John Early? So John Early he began his career in his father's stone carving and sculpture shop outside of DC. He focused on carving and sculpture. After his father's death, he transitioned into doing more stucco and plaster work. In the early 1900s, he began experimenting with exposed aggregate concrete. So concrete that has the surface brushed back or exposed to allow the stones in the concrete to show. And he started to work with different levels of exposure, grading the stone, very carefully selecting the stone that he was using, the size of the stone and the size of the sand that was used in those mixes to be able to get a very specific color gradation, and density in the concrete mix. He was very inspired by Byzantine architecture and was trying to replicate some of the textures and colors that he saw in that work. He eventually ended up developing a proprietary mix that was known as mosaic concrete. And he's known for some of his work. In the photos here are some examples of the Parthenon, which is down. It's a recreation, full-scale recreation of the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. And then he's also known for work at Meridian Hill Park, which is the upper image there. So if we look here at this slide, this shows a close-up example on the right of the early concrete mix, and on the left of some of the patched concrete at the Orchid House that had been unsuccessful in matching that. And you can see in the stonework in the aggregate on the right, there's a very dense compaction of that stone. You see very little of the sand or mortar between the stone. Whereas on the left-hand side, not only is the stone different colored, but it's also, there's a lot of space between, and that really affects how the light is reflected from the building and the coloration that you see on the facades of the building. So looking at this project and knowing that there had been these challenges with matching the concrete, we reached out with the construction manager to a number of consultants who had worked on the project, who worked on early projects throughout the country. Specifically, we reached out to persons who were involved in the Parthenon restoration down in Nashville, and we ended up being put in touch with Robert Armbruster, who is a recognized expert on early concrete. He had done a lot of work at the Baha'i Temple outside of Chicago, and really has done work around the country in understanding how to source the aggregates and how to construct the material, the concrete in the way that Early would have done. So we engaged him on the project, and we brought him on to really kind of provide guidance on how the construction of the concrete should take place, how the formwork should be placed, and just some of the specifications. He was also very instrumental in helping us to identify where the aggregates could be sourced. So early in the project, what we needed to do was to, for bidding and construction purposes, we needed to have a very clear direction to contract as to what would be bid and priced. And so we needed to identify the stone that would be used in the mix, and very specifically the types of sand and where that would be sourced. So early on, we had to do cleaning of the existing facades to, as closely as possible, obtain good representation of the original colors of that concrete. And then we, with Bob's guidance, undertook a very extensive sample process where we used different aggregate mixes of different sizes, different sands, different pigments, and we created a series of small scale samples which were shipped from Chicago to Longwood, and we reviewed those on site with a variety of existing locations on the building with the original concrete. So you see on the right hand image is an example of some of those samples being reviewed on the south elevation of the Orchid House. And you can see, these are in progress. You can still see there's a little bit of surface texture variation. We're still working on the exposure of that aggregate to get that match correct, but we're starting to, if you look at the patch on the lower right hand side, compared to the samples, you see that the stone and the aggregate and the density is starting to get closer to that original concrete appearance. So then, having identified, we eventually identified a mix that we would use as the basis of design. The next step was to a very detailed survey of the exterior of the building and documenting the types of repairs that would be needed on the elevation. We did this for both the interior and the exterior. John Early, it's all concrete, but he had a variety of installation techniques, which I'll touch on in the next slide. But we're looking here, there's different colored areas, different keyed notes that this is an example of some of the construction documents that were put together, identifying where the repairs would be made. These are sketches that Bob prepared, showing the sequence of the repairs and how those repairs would be made and how they'd be installed. John early used cast in place concrete, so that you're placing the raw concrete, the wet concrete, into a mold on site that then hardens, as well as precast concrete, which is cast usually in a controlled environment in a factory, and then the pieces are shipped and installed with different dowels and anchors to the building, as well as a stucco process, which is a unique process whereby he used the concrete mix with a very small amount of sand, and that was troweled onto the structural concrete to achieve the same appearance as the cast in place concrete. And a lot of the columns that you see on the structure, as well as the entablature, is that stucco. So as we were developing those construction details, I'm going to turn this back to Greg to talk a little bit about some of what was being developed in terms of the display on the interior.
So when we began to look at the display, for the 5 years that I've been here, my volunteers and I have been talking about what ways could we make the display better. And honestly, it was hard to come up with ways to do it. But as we began to talk as a design team, we began to throw different ideas out there. One of them is what you see here, which was basically wrought iron baskets that would hold the pots on their own posts. And this was only one of a number of ideas that we threw out there, but because of pragmatic reasons and aesthetic reasons, eventually we actually were pushed right back to the gates that hang on the walls that we've had previously, the same design concepts, but with some major improvements. So one of the challenges that I had previously was when we would water one plant at the top of the display, the water would run straight down onto the ones beneath it, and this would create botrytis on the flowers and cause a lot of different problems. On the next slide, you can see kind of the two-dimensional face of the display as it was previously. So one of our solutions was to create arms that held the plants of different lengths. The other problem was in this old display, all of the rings were screwed onto the wrought iron, and as those rings would grow to rust over time, they would get locked in place. It made it very difficult to have a display that was flexible. And because our orchids in the display are getting changed out 3 times a week, and because we're trying to accommodate plants of all different sizes and their growth habits and all sorts of things, it made it quite challenging to really achieve what we were after. So when we returned to this gate idea, we came with a whole bunch of improvements and solutions for some of the challenges that we had previously. And then basically we handed it over to Joshua, and he did a lot of the work to refine this and actually turn it into reality, which is what he's going to tell you about now.
As Greg mentioned, the existing displays were very two-dimensional. In the center image here, you see an example of a historic orchid display where the iron hoop is fixed to the backup iron grill, that the decorative ironwork. And our concept to try to give Greg the most flexibility with changing the display and also just accommodating the variety of plant sizes and display conditions was to sort of keep that hoop, that pot holder idea, but provide a series of interlocking, interchangeable brackets that could be, and arms that could be changed in and out. So we took those two concepts, the fixed hoops on the grate, as well as brackets, and we see if I get my slide to, we looked at different examples, both at Longwood as well as historic examples of wrought ironwork and grills, and looked for inspiration there. So on the larger image on the screen is actually the historic iron grills that were in the orchid case, which have been cleaned, and they're waiting to be finished in this image. We did not have any idea about how much detail was on that ironwork because of the years of paint and rust and corrosion. And so looking at examples like that, and then some of the other images on the screen of other ironwork, both at Longwood and elsewhere, we developed with Longwood's input an approach to the orchid display, which at the exterior walls, we have this decorative iron grate that is installed in front of the glass. It's on the east and west walls. It is a pair of grates that is hinged so that you can still access the glass for cleaning and maintenance, but is normally in a closed position and acts as a trellis in front of the windows. And then on that system, we have a series of brackets. I believe we're at about, for a pair of these, we're several hundred bracket points that we can interchange different arms and pot holders. So in this plan, you'll see an example of the variety of lengths of pot holders that can be accommodated. We go from anywhere from 0, the hoop is right on the grate, up to an 18-inch bracket, and then within those different pot sizes. We took those drawings and we worked with our structural engineer to assess the weight of the plants, taking a sort of a most heavily weighted condition with wet soil, and then developed anchoring details to the concrete, and then enlarged. This is an enlarged drawing showing the different components that we broke the grate down into so that it could be fabricated using both a combination of stock bar size as well as forged metal. So this is all a custom grate that's being fabricated in Philadelphia as we speak. And it is we looked at a variety of materials and finishes for the grate, settling on a stainless steel just for durability and also strength, but a painted finish to replicate the historic ironwork that was in the original Orchid case. And then this is an early concept rendering, which shows the grate and what it might look like with some of the plantings and orchids mounted to it. Concurrent with the actual display system, there was also some development of the space itself. So on the screen is an example, is an illustration of, without the plantings, an illustration of the Orchid House as it previously existed. So you'll see on the plan drawing on the right, the orchid case originally or currently would have been located in the center of the space, separating what was the banana house from the Orchid House. So as we started developing how this would be reconfigured to accommodate Greg's display, this was an early concept of the planting layout. And initially there was talk about locating the orchid case to the south so that we had one large open display area with now this is showing the potted plants that were post mounted at the perimeter, but the idea was to provide a greater area for guest circulation, as well as display of a greater number of plants around the perimeter. And Greg addressed some of the challenges with that initial post-mounted system, one of them being the penetrations in the floor and the waterproofing. And so as we looked at the new display system, we looked at a couple different configurations for the space. This was one that we looked at, which moved the orchid case to the east wall here between the Silver Garden and the orchid case, trying to take advantage of the fact that this is a mostly planted wall and not having that orchid case blocking an exterior wall. And in this concept that we explored, we looked at having a central wall that would have the orchids mounted to it, and then we would circulate guests around that wall. We also, one of the things with the orchid, with now the Orchid House being exposed on 3 sides as part of the West Conservatory project and all being exterior walls, we have to think about how the space is conditioned in cooler months. And so we're looking in this option at a north vestibule so that we could condition the air to protect the orchids, particularly around the Christmas season when that cold exterior air would impact them. From there, we eventually landed on a scheme that looks like this, which shifts the orchid case from the center column line up to the north column line, and it places the orchid case in line with the acacia passage wall. And in this rendering, we're showing panels, which are not part of the project, but in this rendering, you'll see a glass wall that is constructed full height in the north portion of the orchid space, and then the orchid case beneath it. And what that did is it allowed us to create a vestibule that was internal to the structure while still maintaining the majority of the orchid house for the display of plants. And as we were researching the building and looking through original drawings and just understanding better what that original construction was, what we realized was that originally was the configuration that DuPont had built the structure in. So you'll see here is a historic drawing. This is of the north end of the orchid house, or at that point, the west display house. But you'll see here along that column line, a glass wall. And we found drawings that actually, we don't have them in this presentation, but we found drawings that in 1928, this glass wall was modified to locate the orchid case underneath of it. This is a historic photograph from shortly following the original construction in 1921. You can see this is the glass wall that existed at the time of the original construction. And in 1928, up beneath this bar, the current day orchid case would have been installed at this location. And that's where it would have been until, as Greg mentioned, it was shifted to the center of the space, I think in 1988. So here is a rendering showing the final configuration of the space. We have, as you come from the new West Conservatory project, there will be an entrance point into the historic conservatory structures here at the northwest corner of the Orchid House, and as well as the north elevation of the Orchid House. And there will be a vestibule up here at the north side, which will help condition the exterior from the interior spaces. And then we have the restored orchid cases with the restored orchid, the iron grill and display system that would have been there originally. And then we have at the perimeter, we have our new orchid system on the display grills. Some other things just in addition to the display that are being done architecturally, we have extensive repairs to the bronze doors and windows. And we have new at the north and northwest elevations, we're recreating new bronze doors and windows to replace ones that have been previously modified or removed. So we will have a new entrance at the north and the northwest that will match the original bronze work. We also, just a brief summary of other restoration work, the glass roof is being replaced in its entirety to address leaking. There's structural steel is being repaired at the trusses, and the floor is being completely replaced. That was going to address a lot of leakage into the tunnels, and it'll also enable Longwood to have get the equipment that they need into that space, because the current floor, due to deterioration, doesn't accommodate the equipment loads that they have. And just a real quick update on where we are now. So we are now moving into construction. And one of the early things that we're still working through it, but is a series of very extensive mock-ups. So these are examples of some of the concrete mock-ups that are being done on site. Testing the methodology of installing that concrete. These are examples of column capitals and some of the architrave banding temporarily installed on a wall on site that are testing how that formwork works, how the concrete is finished after the formwork is removed. This is an example of a full-scale cornice that's been mocked up, looking at the aggregate exposure and the trying to just get a very crisp line in that detailing. And then this is an example of a precast baluster that was being reviewed for finish. We also, as part of the mock-up process, had a full-scale mock-up of one of the iron display grails with the brackets. And this enabled us to look at different attachment types, look at different finishes, how the material is tooled and worked, and just it allowed for comment and additional development of that design at a full scale during construction. And I'll turn it back to Greg.
So hopefully you are very excited. I am certainly incredibly excited. And as I was watching, it occurred to me that what you've just seen in the last 40 minutes is actually the culmination of hundreds and hundreds of hours of work and meetings over the last 3 years. And it is all coming together, and we will see it opening at the end of this year. And it is incredibly exciting. And what our new display is going to be able to do for us is it's going to give us flexibility in the orchid display like we've never had before. Expect to see more interesting and more carefully curated displays of plants, especially of special groups of plants, ways in which we've not been able to use our space before. We'll now be able to group things a certain way or highlight a specific plant and have it stand alone. Expect to see more interpretation too, to walk into the house and not just see the names of plants, but to have interpretive signage that help you to know why it is that what you're looking at is so special or so important, or why at least I care so much about it. And to see more of that color design as we are able to shift things around more freely. And one of the things that I think is going to be really wonderful is in the past, we always use spathiphyllums at the floor level to create a sense of space. But now those orchids are going to be coming out at anywhere up to 18 inches out towards you. So you'll be able to approach the walls directly and really be able to look at the plants and appreciate them in a really novel way, something that we've never really been able to do before. Definitely expect this space to feel warmer and more inviting. The ambiance that we're aiming to create is something like an art gallery, where you can enter the space and genuinely have a moment to pause and appreciate what you're looking at. The display design should be clean and balanced. And I really think the overall impression is going to be absolutely fantastic. I am unbelievably excited about this project. Certainly one of the most incredible things I've ever been a part of. I hope you are too. Tell other people about what an incredible opportunity we have here to take something that is so integral to the heart of Longwood. Pierre and Alice DuPont were founding members of the American Orchid Society, and we've been growing orchids here for over 100 years now. And so that's an exciting thing to be a part of. And in conjunction with that, today I'm actually assembling our temporary orchid display by the green wall in the conservatory. We have our old gates that hung on the walls of the old orchid display are actually, we kind of combined some of them, we powder coated them, they're completely new, and that'll be our temporary display that will be there until everything goes over to the new orchid display come Christmas time. And so I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions, but I hope you're excited about the incredible things that are happening here and in the orchid collection and orchid display. And with that, I will turn it over to Nicole so she can navigate what comes next.
Thank you, Greg. All right, at this point, we are going to stop screen sharing and we are going to answer some questions. But I want to thank all of our panelists. It is an exciting project. Very detailed, lots of thought went into it. So we are very excited to see it coming to fruition. So we have a few questions about, Greg, they're going to be for you first on specific orchids. I didn't think we'd be able to get away from that. Somebody says they are new to growing orchids and enjoying the learning process. How do you combat gnats? They seem to love the humidity that the orchids prefer.
The good news is gnats aren't going to affect your plant very much. You can top dress, if you have plants in sphagnum moss, you can top dress it with either like a fine gravel or a fine bark, which will help to keep them from being able to lay their eggs in it. Basically, they're using the wet moss, or if it's fairly wet bark, as a substrate for their nesting. But the good news is it won't cause any trouble for your orchids. You can also use sticky cards, or you could mist the surface of your media with diluted rubbing alcohol or something like that. There's plenty of other things, but those are some basic approaches to tackling gnats.
Thank you, Greg. All right, there are a couple questions about the banana trees and what will happen to them.
Yes, I thought of that halfway through. I said, oh, I should have said that. Rest assured, true to Longwood, the bananas have been preserved. A good number of them have actually been relocated to the children's garden. And so the children's garden is now open, I believe. And so you can see the banana trees over there where they continue to live and grow.
Awesome. There is a question about, will you have a display location for the cooler growing orchids that are presently displayed in the alcove?
That is a great question. One of the aspects of this redesign that I'm excited about is I believe we will have a greater opportunity to control the temperature of the display. And because of the way it's situated now with open sides, I think we'll have way more temperature control in this space. So they won't necessarily have their own space. My hope is that we'll be able to integrate them into the full display more easily without having to worry so much about the temperature. It's a great question.
Yes. When you change out the orchids, do you replace them with the same variety or a different variety?
We replace them with whatever is in flower at the time. So typically on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we're pulling out anywhere between 20 and 40 plants from the collection, and it's whatever is in perfect flower at that time. So the things that are coming out of the display are simply being replaced by whatever is available. But our collection is designed so that at least in the cases where we can have the same genus flowering throughout the year, we do have it there. Some things only flower at a certain time of year, but we try to have as much variety as possible, as often as possible.
Perfect. All right, this might be a question for Joshua or Christopher. Did you consult with other renowned orchid collections in the redesign process, such as the Orchid Garden at the Botanic Garden in Singapore, which is also quite old?
I kick that one to Greg. From an architectural standpoint, we worked largely with Longwood and relied on their direction for what they were trying to achieve.
Yeah, actually, this is a very good question. In-house, most of us have visited most of the major orchid collections around the country. Not me, but other people in the world. And so in looking at some of those other collections and how they displayed them, for the aesthetic at Longwood, we really felt that what was going on in other places wasn't suitable for us. Some of them are incredibly beautiful. There are places that I love to go and visit, but none that really fit what we're doing here and could offer us what we needed. So we definitely looked at them. We considered a lot of other options and what other gardens had done. But at the end of the day, after considering all the options, we ended up almost right back where we started, just with some really key adjustments and improvements. It's a good question.
Great. Are you taking volunteers in the orchid greenhouses?
I am currently maxed out on volunteers, but what you absolutely can do is reach out to our volunteer coordinator. And I'm sure there's a way to access that through the website. I don't know offhand exactly what it is. And let them know that you are interested in volunteering with the orchids. And they actually keep all of those names. So if I have someone retire, or if we do have room for more volunteers to come on, especially, there may be a possibility of that as we approach reopening here. They'll compile that list, and then we'll be able to go right through it and pull people from it.
That's always a popular question. Was it difficult to develop the mosaic concrete formula, or were you able to find one?
It was a very involved process. Bob Armbruster, who we consulted with and who is still involved in the project, put a lot of legwork into that. So we took coring samples of the concrete at the Orchid House and had that tested in a laboratory to identify the sources of the stone and aggregates and the sands and the composition of that material. But then the challenge was locating current day sources for that stone. John Early's studio was in the DC area, and where he had originally sourced a lot of the aggregate was from the Potomac, from dredging that occurred in the Potomac. A lot of that sand and stone went into his mixes, and that source is no longer available. So Bob had a network of quarries and sources across the country, and he was able to identify the type of stone and source that from another location. But it's not one recipe fits all. So what is at Longwood is not necessarily what is at other John Early projects. He sort of worked to develop an appearance in the concrete that he was looking for. And then there's also one of the things that we had to consider was just the exposure. so originally the aggregate was heavily exposed, or it was exposed, and the sand was brushed back. But even now that the building is 100 years old, you have one exposure on the exterior that is not the same as the exposure on the interior. So we're also working with trying to match on the exterior of the building a slightly different exposure due to the weathering that's occurred as well. And so the process is a little bit different for how that's achieved. So we've been working with Bob. I'd have to go back and look at dates, but well over a year, probably 1.5 to 2 years now that we've been developing that. And we're still in the mock-up process. I mean, we've done sample after sample after sample, and there's still samples that are being tweaked on site. So it's an ongoing process.
Thank you. How easily and quickly will you be able to swap around the orchid pot holders with the new system? And how often do you think you'll be changing the holders around?
I think potentially we'll be doing it every day. So one of the changes that I'm making is we used to change the display only Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and now we're going to probably change it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, so that we have less plants on each day, but more time to actually rearrange. And Joshua can attest, when we looked at the mock-up of the rings and how easy it is to slip them in and out, it's so easy to do and feasible. I think there's going to be a lot of flexibility. So even if you come every day, I think you're going to see a pretty consistent flow to the aesthetic of the display and how it changes based on what plants are coming into flower. So it's going to be changing quite a lot, I think.
And when do you foresee the opening of this first phase, Greg?
So
or Josh?
The orchid display should open at Christmas. I believe that is the official date we've released. So it will come in with great bombast at least when our Christmas display opens.
Wonderful. All right. To what extent does Longwood in general recirculate, reuse water? And with the new construction, has that process been upgraded or improved?
So I can't speak to the West Conservatory. Joshua might. We do a lot of very careful water usage here. I think I'm going to let Joshua take that.
I'm not sure to the extent that they reuse water, but I know as part of the Orchid House project, I touched on the concrete and some of the larger architectural items, but we are completely replacing all of the systems in the building. So the steam, heat, all the electric, the irrigation, the domestic water, those systems are all being replaced and they'll be upgraded to address deficiencies in the current systems. As far as the specifics of reuse, I'm not sure what percentages are recycled.
In a similar vein, will climate change affect concrete ware and orchid types available?
Can you say that again?
Will climate change affect the concrete ware and what types of orchids are available? This is probably both.
As far as orchids available, we will be okay with that. If we get warmer, we'll have even more orchids available to us. It won't necessarily change what orchids are available, but if we see significant shifts, we may actually see changes in when certain orchids flower. Like when we had that especially warm winter 2 winters ago, it affected and pushed some orchids flowering earlier a month or two or later a month or two. But that won't affect the display because we have enough plants that will always be able to fill it. But we do see, especially if you watch them every day, you do see some minute changes because of those things.
As far as the concrete ware, I do think, I don't know that we have hard data that we can point to, but we have in the past 20 years, we've seen with the freeze thaw cycles that with the warming and cooling in the winter, that does take, it does seem to be taking a greater toll on concrete and masonry systems. So to the extent that we can detail to keep water out of the structure, that's really where that would come into play. So we have a lot of new flashings and roof details that we're working on that to prevent a lot of the water infiltration that is occurring to the current structure and causing the concrete deterioration. A lot of what you see on the exterior with the deteriorated concrete is a result of water that gets into the building and then with swings in temperature, especially in the winter, you tend to see the damage coming from that. So I think anecdotally, there's probably some increased wearing due to climate change.
All right, back to Greg. What time do you change orchids out, after closing or before opening hours?
Change them out in the morning before everyone arrives.
There we go. And can you repeat how many orchids Longwood has in the collection?
Yeah, so we have almost 6,000 orchids. And that number will continue to grow, but right now it's almost 6,000.
All right, and this can be for anybody. What problem did you run into that surprised you the most?
It's a good question, obviously.
There's one of the things that there are a lot of challenges with the project. It's a very unique project. One of the things that we are working through is just material compatibilities, and just also with the way the space functions as a very wet, humid environment, and different metals with the bronze work that's in there, different piping systems, cast iron, copper, stainless steel, just working through the compatibility of those different materials and detailing them in a way that won't be corrosive. I don't know that completely surprised us, but it's a complexity that we're working on. I could probably think of some others if I had a few minutes, but.
Okay, how about any special lighting considerations in the orchid space?
So we are replacing all of the lighting. The system that will provide the primary lighting will be similar to what is in the main conservatory. That will be mounted to the trusses. It's a series of adjustable spots that can be set up and change direction, and they're adjustable. So they will largely be set in place based on the permanent display, but if Longwood would want to add additional heads or change up how they are lighting the space, they have the flexibility to do that. And then we also, as part of the West Conservatory, there will be some exterior lighting at the perimeter of the building. That's not going to be part of this initial restoration, but in the 2024 opening, there would be some exterior lighting that will light the facade of the building as part of that project. We also have lighting that we're working through, an LED system for the orchid case itself. We have a panelized LED light in the ceiling of the orchid case to light the plants on a closer level. So,
Great.
Which is where I'll be going after this, actually. Just to go and look at a mock-up of that lighting.
All right, and I think we have one good question to end on. And if we didn't get to your questions, I think we got to them all, but feel free to email membership@longwoodgardens.org and we can try to get you those answers. But the last question, what is your greatest success so far?
Can I just say this whole project? I think this project is a tremendous success that will echo through what happens at Longwood for the next 100 years. So I think this is in and of itself a great success.
I think so. I have two things that I would say. One, I think in working with Greg, coming up with a display system that offers the flexibility for them and the ability to both the three-dimensional display system so that it's not a static flat display, and just the flexibility to be able to change that on a daily basis for what he needs. From a construction standpoint, there's a lot of complexity with the way John Early installed his concrete, with a lot of the details you see on the wall. Some of those are cast in place, and then you have infill between them with the stucco. And the stucco was a very difficult system to match. Just with the way that the troweling of that concrete in place, it changes the way the aggregate is oriented. And so in working, and I have to give credit to the contractor who spent a lot of time doing mock-ups, tearing them down, doing them again, tearing them down. We're testing it, but they've come up with a way that we think we can pour a very thin veneer that achieves a very close match to the original concrete, which I know, and just looking at the other structures on site and in walking to Longwood, it's been years of trying to get a match to that concrete. And I think that probably one of the biggest successes that I see is being able to find a methodology to achieve that for them that can be replicated for future repairs. So.
That's great. Well, I want to thank all of our panelists again. It's been wonderful having you. We look forward to the day we can be with all of you and all of our members in that space again, and it is not that far away. So thank you all, and we will see you in the garden soon.